Hi, I'm Bill Flowers, commonly called Bill, William B. Flowers. I'm really a senior. I was born in DeLand on August 11th, 1929. I'll tell you a little bit about my grandparents first. My grandfather Flowers, who was Benjamin Mitchell Flowers, and Carrie Delta Flowers, his wife, my grandmother, came to DeLand Springs in 1896 by paddleboat steamer. My grandfather was born in Georgia, and my grandmother was born in North Carolina. Where they came from before they came to DeLand, I have no idea right now. But he opened a blacksmith shop in DeLand, and one of the first things that contracts that he had was the wheel for the sugar mill at the Springs had been destroyed, and it was lying on the ground, and it had to have some repair work and of course put back up so it would turn, and wood was all burned off of it. He mounted the wheel, did the repair work, and put virgin cypress in it sometime just before the turn of the century. And it turned till just several years ago when the state decided it was not safe and stopped the wheel from spinning. But Bond Lumber Company had a big sawmill in Glenwood, and my grandfather was the head blacksmith shop for the sawmill there. He later worked for Bond Lumber Company as blacksmith in the Lake Helen sawmill, and he was also head sawyer and blacksmith for the Osceola sawmill, which was just at the north end of Lake Harney, at which time Floyd Land was the bookkeeper, and Floyd Land was the father of Joy Mansonig, who she and her husband lived for a long time here in DeLand. My father was born in DeLand Springs in September of 1904. I don't know a whole lot about his early life in DeLand, but I know that when he was a teenager that they moved to Lake Helen, where grandfather was the blacksmith, and there he met my mother, who was Eva Lee, whose parents were Flora and William Lee. My mother was born in Bamboo in 1904.
Where's Bamboo, Bill?
Bamboo is up around Citrus and Island Grove and Spar, up between Ocala, just east and south of Gainesville. Well, east of Ocala and south of Gainesville. Mother and Dad were married as best as I could figure. I don't have the marriage license, but I think because my dad was 18, so it'd be about 1920. Well, Dad wasn't quite 18. About 1920, 21. And 1924, Junior Lee Flowers was born to Tom and Eva Flowers. My brother attended Lake Helen School, and he was drafted in the Army in World War II, and he hit the beach D-Day +1, fought across France, and was going into Germany, crossing the Moselle River when he was wounded and died from his wounds at age 21. As a small kid, we lived in Lake Helen, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about early life in Lake Helen. as a small kid, I can remember my dad. That of course in those days we didn't have a lot of people in Florida, and there was a lot of jobs available. And a job came up, you had to be able to do the job. And my dad was a very talented man, and he could repair your car, outboard motor, paint your house, do plastering. He could build your house from the ground up, do the plumbing. He had all the tools. If your house was sagging, he had tools. He could jack your house up and level it. And one of the most vivid jobs I remembered him doing was, because we lived on Water Street. We were only about 150 yards away from the power plant and the ice plant. And Dad bid, and he got the job to paint the water tank in Lake Helen. And that was the days before all the sandblasting and everything, and I'm with a steel brush and a paintbrush. I could see from our porch, I could see Dad hanging up there with that paintbrush and steel brush, brushing and painting that tank. And I don't know how long it took him, but it took him a long time hanging there in that little seat and rigging it up.
About what year was that?
It had to be about 1932, 33, along in there. I was about 5 years old, I guess.
Okay.
Somewhere along in there. Being my dad was a carpenter or contractor, you might as well say, he was real friendly with all the spiritualists in Cassadaga. And as a kid, I could hear him talking about John Slater and some of the other things. And he built most of the houses that were built in the spiritualist camp there over the years. Like I say, he was a young man. He was very talented. Along came Prohibition, and where the real money was in moonshine. And my father and Bill Roberts, his brother-in-law, they were moonshiners. They made moonshine out on the river. And they made good moonshine, according to my grandmother Flowers, that they came from counties and counties away to buy Tom and Bill Roberts' moonshine. They never got caught.
How did they avoid getting caught?
Well, from what I hear, they paid the sheriff. Now, whether that's true or not, I really couldn't tell you.
Do you know who the sheriff was at that time?
Supposedly Ed Stone, so I don't know.
Yeah.
But anyhow, one of the things, they had a Model T or Model A Skeeter, we call it, no body on it, just a homemade body and the windshield up front. But when they left the river with the moonshine, of course most of the roads then were not paved. They were sand or clay, or some of them, the good roads were shell. But they always carried, according to my mother, a pine tree, a fresh cut pine tree, or fairly, with a rope on it. So if they got to be chased, why, they could throw that thing off of the back and they'd set up a smoke screen by going down a dirt road where they could get away. But fortunately, they never got caught moonshining. And as a byproduct of the moonshine out there, why, they had hogs back in the days when the cattle and hogs just had their marking. And for many years, why, we had a regular hog farm along the river there that were the Flowers' pigs. But that's been many, many years ago, of course, and they're all gone now.
Do you know much about the economics of moonshining? Do you know how much it cost them to produce it, and then how much they made selling it?
No, I have no idea. But let me just say something about my grandmother Flowers. Now, being the moonshine came up. But my grandmother ran the county welfare farm, Carrie Delta Flowers. And she was a member of the anti-ring back in the ring days, along with Johnny Soap Cash, Judge Peacock, and with the help of Claude Pepper. But then she ran that welfare farm. Every now and then my dad said he would give her a sack of sugar. Or she would give him a sack of sugar to help him out in the shine business. And while she would do that, and later he had a chance to go into package store business with somebody, and she says, no son of mine's going to sell whiskey. She must have got religion somewhere along the way. But I have no, but I can remember as a small kid in our garage apartment that we lived in Lake Helen, and Crocs, copper tubing, and dynamite caps, and because when they left the still, they had dynamites planted around, and if you tripped on the wire while you blew them still, and maybe yourself up too. But I can remember that vividly when I was a kid, because one room was full of all that stuff, moonshining. But
Did you spend some time out at the still?
Oh no. That was before my time.
Before your time.
My brother may have, but not I.
Yeah.
But Mother finally talked him out. Well, Bill Roberts had an accident, and he died. And Mother talked Dad out of making moonshine, but he made a little 2-quart still, and set on the kerosene stove at home, and I can see that perking today on there. And for a long while he made 2 quarts at a time, but or a quart or whatever he was making there, but he finally quit that, and he gave it to an old colored gentleman that my grandfather had befriended and looked after, and my dad, after my grandfather moved to New Smyrna, my dad looked after. And from our porch, 2nd-story porch there, I could see his house down on Lake Macy, and it'd be 100 degrees outside, but you'd see a fire coming out of his chimney where he had that little old still sitting on his wood stove, and he was making, he had some beautiful big hogs from the mash that he fed there. But in the about the middle 30s, my dad was building a big house in Cassadaga, and a fellow came in and he looked at the work, and he asked my dad, he says, this is beautiful work. And he says, who's building this house? My dad said, well, me and my helper there are building the house. And the guy says, well, who's the contractor? He said, well, I'm the contractor, and that's my helper. And he said, well, if you can build houses like this, he says, I want you to come to work for me. And Dad said, where is that? He said, Baltimore, Maryland. They said, man, that's a long ways from Volusia County. But I'll remember it as long as I live. And one day he came in from guiding. By the way, my dad started guiding many, many years ago. Probably back in, well, I know in the middle 20s, when Horace Pug Allen, who ran the College Arms golf course here for the Hotel College Arms, talked Dad into, because Dad loved to fish, to guiding some of the Yankees in the wintertime when they came down here. And so he started guiding. So between his guiding and his other work, why, I can never remember being hungry. We always had food on the table. We always had an automobile. And we might not have had much money, but we were comfortable. And now I've lost my train of thought.
That's okay. Did your father keep himself armed? I mean, I don't know, for the moonshine was kind of a dangerous occupation.
Well, My dad, he wore 238s all the time, shoulder holster. Wherever he went, he had 238s. And his partner in the moonshine business, Bill Roberts, was his brother-in-law, always wore a German Luger on his hip. And that's what his accident was. Somehow or another, it went off and shot himself right through the artery in his right leg, and he bled to death before they could get him to the hospital the old hospital where we're talking today. But my dad was always a crap shooter, shooting dice. He loved to shoot. Bill Roberts was a card player, and if he could find a card game going anywhere, he would go. But I'm just rambling now. But when Dad was known all these spiritualists and all. A lot of people thought he was crazy and all, but through the medium, they got to talk where they would talk to the table. You know, a lot of people played a game on that, and they'd put their hands on, ask the table questions, and ask it to do this, that, and the other. But Mother and Dad had got to know these spiritualists pretty well, especially my dad. And several times things happened, and he went over, and John Slater told him right exactly what had happened, and he recovered things and found out things that John said was true. And but a few days before Bill Roberts had his accident, he came by the house, and this was in the 20s, middle 20s, and he had $3,000 cash money. I'm sure he'd won it playing poker somewhere, and he asked my mother to keep it. And my mother said, Bill, I would not be responsible for that much money. Please go put it in the post office. You know, in that day you could put money in the post office just like you can in the bank today. And he said, well, I don't trust banks and I don't trust post offices. And he was dead 2 days later, and nobody ever found out what happened to that $3,000. In those days, $3,000 you could buy several nice houses for $3,000 back in the 20s. Yeah. And but that didn't.
Now let's go back to your mother and the anti-ring. Now, how did she get involved in politics? Or was that your grandmother?
That was Grandmother Flowers.
Okay, let's
Grandmother Flowers. How she got involved in it, I don't know really, but she may have been earlier than before Bert Fish got a hold of the county, you might as well say. But she was running the county welfare farm out there back of where Fish Memorial, West Volusia is.
Now, what was the welfare farm?
It was for the poor folks, sick and elderly that, you know, just couldn't go.
Okay.
I mean, they had no place to go and nobody to take care of them.
Kind of like medical care or a nursing home?
Well, the whole thing.
Okay.
And the doctors came. In fact, I've got a picture. My mother worked for my grandmother for a while. I've got a picture of me in a stroller there at the old welfare farm at home when I was a little kid in a little old teeny thing that you scoot around in. Couldn't even walk probably.
Yeah.
But another interesting thing about her running the welfare farm is, and then I'll get back to the story here, is that Jim Ed Summerhill, Alan Summerhill Funeral Homes, had the contract with the county to bury the indigents out there. And my grandmother, bless her soul, she was bow-legged as she could be, but she would walk out there, and she would always making sure that Jimmy had buried them deep enough. She'd always have a stick, and she'd stick it down in one corner. And after a while, Jim Ed told me that, he said, you know, there's a lot of people buried shallow out there because she kept putting that stick there. So, of course, in those days, everything was dug by hand, and probably still is today, I don't know. But they would dig that one corner just a little bit deeper. So he said there was a lot of people buried then. But anyhow, with grandmother running that, between the, you might well say the poor people or people on welfare or whatever, both black and white, she had a big bunch of people that she, you might well say, had control of. And the politicians all sought Carrie Delta's favor. And she stayed with Judge Peacock and Johnny Socash in the anti-ring until I guess the very end when it all broke up. But she was a power for them, and that with the help of Claude Pepper, because she could get on the phone and call him, and he'd call her right back. I don't know what the relationship was, but I know
he was a congressman in Washington.
Yeah, I know that, but I don't know what her relation and him was at all. But he would call her back, and
do you have any knowledge of the anti-ring and the ring and what kinds of things they did?
Well, from my knowledge was that hearing my mother and dad talk, unless you were a good friend or paid homage of some sort, you were beholden, if you worked in the county for any kind of a job hardly at all, to Bert Fish and Francis Whitehair.
And they were the ring or the anti-ring?
They were the ring.
They were the ring.
They just about controlled the county. I might tell you a little bit of something about Francis Whitehair was a friend of the family's in later years. My uncle worked for him for a long time, and my dad guided him many times, him especially after World War II, when during World War II Francis was Under Secretary of the Navy, and he brought a lot of generals and admirals and high muckety mucks from Washington down, and my dad fished them all. But in his later years, Francis got real demanding, and he'd have people come in, and he'd call maybe the night before or the day before and say, "Tom, I've got some people in here. I want you to take fishing for me, and tomorrow." And Dad'd say, "Well, you know, I've got a guide party. Well, cancel them." Well, my dad did it for years. And then one night, Francis called, and Dad had had a few drinks and was upset about something, I don't know what. But Francis called and said he had some people there, he wanted him to fish, and Daddy said, "Well, I've got a guide party," and Francis came up with his regular thing, "Well, cancel them and take my people." And Dad jumped on Francis and told him, says, "Look, you know, when these people are coming in, you can call ahead just like the rest of the people if you want to fish with me." And he says, "Francis, I don't want you to ever call me again, because you'll never get in my boat again to go fishing." And that, he never did. And I remember one time after that, Dad and I were out fishing, and we pulled in, and Francis and his chauffeur and handyman, Tony Viscounti, were fishing, and Francis said, "Tom, I see the old master's got his son out this morning." And he said, "Yep, y'all done any good?" And Dad said, "Well, son, see, can you pick that stringer up?" And I couldn't get it out of the well. And he said, "Tom, I'd like to take a picture of that." And he did. And about 3 days later in the mail, I got a picture and a nice little note from Francis, and so did the Dad. But they never fished together again. But getting back to my dad, and when the fellow said, "Well, if you can build houses like that, I'd like for you to work for me." Well, I remember as long as I lived, my dad came in one day from guiding, and he hollered up to Mother. He says, "Mom," says, "start packing." He says, "I'm going to take Ralph up on that offer, that job in Maryland." And we packed up that night, Mother, Dad, my brother, and I, we headed off in the Model A Ford for Baltimore, Maryland. Going up US 1, we spent the next, we got up the next morning at my grandmother Lee's house in Estill, South Carolina. Spent a day there, and then we took off, and the next night that old Model A got as far as Roanoke, Virginia. And the next day we pulled into Maryland, and Dad started building big two-story brick and stone houses for Ralph Talbot. And when the weather got cold, we'd come back to Florida. And this lasted up until World War II started, and we got caught in Baltimore. Dad had several big contracts to build defense houses around Martin Plant and the Bethlehem Steel Yard, and but about 1940, latter part of 43 or 44, I guess it was, we moved back to DeLand. Been here ever since. I attended early school at Lake Helen, then I got to junior high school, came to DeLand, graduated from DeLand, and 1948 played football for 2 years for the high school. And
What position did you play?
I played left guard.
Yeah.
Speck Martin was our coach, and Zaretti was our assistant coach or second coach, and we ran from an unbalanced line to the right, and that year we lost one game, and that was to Mainland. Yeah. We tied 2, but we lost only one game, and we won the conference, which was then the East Florida conference champ.
Who were some of your teammates?
Marty McLaughlin, who still lives here in town. He retired from Florida Power Corporation. And then there was starting from the left side of the line, and then by myself. Marty was 133 pounds. I was left guard at 155. Our center was Ken Penton. I don't know where Ken is today. And he was about 140, maybe 150 pounds. And next to him was his brother, Bill Penton, who was married to Lorena McPhee here in DeLand. And Bill is now deceased. Bill probably weighed about 165. Next to him was the right tackle, the biggest man on the squad, Herb Harris, weighed 175. Big man in his day, big man. Herb went to TCU and played football there. He went on and became a high-ranking officer in the Air Force, and he's now retired from that, and he's teaching, I think, at Texas Christian University in Texas. Right next to him was Keith Lilly. He was about 165. And on the right end was Malcolm Dykes, who his dad had a clothing store here in town for a while, and Don Blowbaum. They alternated. Our quarterback was David Gunby, who still lives here in town, and also Phil Roach, who has a moving concern in Sanford right now. We had several fullbacks, or not fullbacks, but halfbacks during the course of the year because of injuries. There was Donnie Strink, who is retired now from Martin Company. He lives down in Oviedo. And Clifford Kirchhoff, who's retired from some title company. And he lives, I think, in the Winter Park, Orlando area. And John C. Riles, who was in the fruit business here in DeLand for many, many years, who's now deceased. And then there was Lowell Hillman. Lowell was an old country boy, and he was a fullback of the first water. He was great. He didn't know his own strength. He wasn't a big boy, but he was a bull on offense and defense. And of course, in those days, you played offense and defense. You didn't play one way. You played both ways. When you turned the ball over, you just went from offense to defense. And we also had Charles Beatty, who was a halfback. And Charles held the state record for the 100-yard dash. I think for 4 years he was in high school. He now lives somewhere in Alabama, I think. He went to Alabama on a track scholarship. But that was a football team. When I graduated in 48, we were living on Lake Beresford, and we had a fish camp there. And I started the Stetson. When I first started the Stetson, they were on the quarter system. And then they switched to semester. And my folks never had a lot of money, and so I had to work and I started guiding. Well, let me go back to about guiding, me guiding. When we moved back from, or came back, excuse me, from up north, Dad building business when he quit. World War II was still going on, and we had our little house in Lake Ellen, but we bought a lot on Lake Beresford, right across the street from my grandmother, who had built a house in the middle 30s on Lake Beresford. And we built a little house there on the lakefront, and built some pools, and got some boats, and started renting them. And but during World War II, my dad was guiding, among other things, and he would guide the officers from the Navy base here for $10 a day, and furnished everything, tackle, bait, everything. And a lot of the sailors, of course, weren't making much money, but I had a 2.5 horsepower Johnson engine on a wooden boat, and I guided for about $4 a day and furnished everything. But $4 in those days for a teenage kid was a pile of money. So I've guided off and on, you might as well say, since I've been 14 years old on the St. John's. Mm-hmm. But on Lake Beresford, we rented boats, and back in the 40s and 50s, fishing. Well, the St. John's River was noted worldwide as the best largemouth black bass fishing in the world, and it had been. Back in the early days, we had an 8-fish limit. This is on bass. 8-fish limit, a 12-inch minimum size, and a 2 months closed season. There was nobody, you might as well say, living in Florida, and we just had bass fishing. If it had water and it had bass, it was excellent fishing. And it was fantastic. I can remember going to high school, and even going to, when I was attending Stetson, had a big guide boat, and we didn't have trailers for them, and 'cause they were so wide. Most of the trailers in those days were homemade anyhow, and we run our boats. If we were going to fish a great distance away from home, we'd run them and leave them, and then drive the car down there. And for many years, right after Christmas, we would run our boats down to the Lemon Bluff area and leave them there. And we would fish down there till March, and then we'd move them back to the land. But it was not uncommon in January and February, when the skipjack herring would come up the river there to see 150 bass in the air at one time and weigh 5 to 10, 12, 14 pounds, schooling on those skipjack herring. And fishing was fantastic. You didn't think very much of catching a 9 or 10 pound bass. It was an everyday occurrence. And but the Game and Fish then turned around and went to a 10 fish limit, no size limit, and no closed season, and left it that way for 40 years. And we grew from a little teeny state to the third most populous. Water quality got worse. Water got less because they drained all the river. Very seldom ever remember back when I was a small kid that the river ran backwards. But during World War II, we were feeding the world, and it already drained the Everglades. And the good old boys in Tallahassee said, you know, that old marsh down there on the headwaters of St. John's, we can do the same thing with that as we do with the Everglades. So what was 2,000 square miles of marsh area on the headwaters of the river turned into 600 square miles. And they diked it and drained it, and the storage area for the river that kept the river flowing north vanished. And from then on, by periods of low water, it was not uncommon for the river to run backwards. The water managers now paying thousands of dollars to buy the stuff back and try to make some reservoirs. But the good old boys in Tallahassee, down in the Fellsmere Drainage District, they said, if you drain an acre, we'll give you an acre. And they gave it away. And now we're going to buy it back at exorbitant prices, but we didn't know. Thought we were doing the right thing, but we weren't. But I graduated from Stetson in 1953.
What did you study there at Stetson?
Well, when I first signed up, I was going to be a football coach. And then I got to thinking about that, and I said, no, that can't do it. So a real good friend of my dad's was a CPA in Chicago, and I'll tell you a story about that too. And he says, you go through the accounting course here and you can come to work for me. Well, that sounded good. Well, I hadn't even thought about that cold weather in Chicago, but at the time Stetson, well, when I started at Stetson was a small school as far as buildings were concerned, and the base was closed down, and a lot of the stuff was housed at the law school, and a lot of the students were in the barracks at the airport. But the faculty, I don't guess, was the best in the world then. But we had an old fellow named Dr. Spurrier, who was the accounting professor for Stetson. And he was an old bachelor, and he was diabetic. And he was a stickler. You'd get about halfway through your text during a semester. You wouldn't cover the whole text. And he was tough. I think the highest grade I ever remember him giving anybody was a 68. There was nothing to get a 10 on a test from him, or even a minus. But I fought him through cost accounting, and I said, you know, I just can't stand this man anymore. So I switched to business major and graduated with a degree in business administration. But speaking of the accountant that told me if I went through this, he would take me on in his office. His sister Margaret McGill owned the Cassadaga Hotel in Cassadaga. And he came down 2 or 3 times a year to visit his sister, and he, of course, Margaret and Dad were great friends, so the fellow always came with Dad out on the river. And one day I remember them coming in. We were living on Lake Beresford, and it was getting pretty close to dark. And Mother had fried chicken and gravy and all this kind of good stuff for supper, and told him, so why don't you come on eat with us, because they'll be finished over at the hotel time you get there. And so the 3 of us, 4 of us, sat down at the table there and had supper. And he said, Tom, he says, today when we were there at Blue Springs and you went to the bathroom, he says, I was talking to Homer Smith owned Blue Springs at that time, and he said he wants to sell it. He said, I'm going to buy it for you. He said, I'm going to take a mortgage back with no monthly payment and no interest and no maturity date. He said, I'm going to buy it for you because I know you'll pay me for it. And Dad said, well, what does Homer want for Blue Springs? He said, $25,000. My dad said, what? Me be obligated for $25,000? No way. The state bought it once. They paid a fortune for it.
Yeah.
But that was something my dad, I can remember as a young kid, I heard my mother and dad talking about a mortgage. And I didn't know what a mortgage was. And my dad left, I went over, I said, Mother, what's this thing, mortgage on the house? And she looked at me, she said, son, if you ever tell anybody we've got a mortgage on our house, I'll skin you alive. But that's just a different generation of people than we have today.
Yeah. When you were at Stetson, but go ahead.
In 1953, when I was a senior, I met Julie Louise Michael, a little old gal from Charleston, South Carolina. I was in the library and I was taking statistics, and I wasn't the best in the world at math. And I was talking to one of the guys there in the library, and I says, I got to find somebody to help me with this math. I just can't figure it out. And this thing's due tomorrow. So that little gal right over there is named Julie, and she's a math major. So I went over and introduced myself. She helped me with my math. And in August of 1954, we became husband and wife. And so I not only got an education, but I got a wife out of Stetson. And
now you had some friends from up north while you were at Stetson too, that you had to teach the ways of the South a little bit.
Oh, when I was going to Stetson, I joined the Sigma Phi Epsilon fraternity, which had just been gone national, and we were in the old Glenn Hospital out on Stone Street. The building had been used in many, many years, and it was not in the best of shape. But the guys, you know, like I was saying, Stetson at the end of World War II had a lot of 21, 22-year-old freshmen coming. They're all coming on the GI Bill. And a lot of these guys had had some experience, being in the service and all this, and they fixed the house up pretty darn nice. And the bottom floor had the dining, and I think one other living quarters beside Mary Furrier, who was our house mother. But a lot of the mornings, if I didn't have too much to do at the fish camp before I came to class, I'd come by early and eat breakfast. And I always got grits and eggs, and I'd put my grits over my egg and put a little butter on top of that and salt and pepper it and stir it up. And the Yankee boys were there eating those grits with milk and sugar. And they'd almost get sick to see me stir an egg up in that grits. And but that was the old Southern way to eat it. And I can remember the first time that we went to Maryland, and Mother went to the grocery store. And I, of course, was a little kid and had to go with her. But you could not buy grits. You go to the A&P store, and grits? What in the world is that? They had the big old round, puffed up hominy, but no grits, no grits. And but I guess grits is pretty well common now most everywhere. But still, you see a lot of Yankees having their hash brown potatoes rather than grits. And hash browns are not bad. But I had a good time at Stetson. I'm the first Flowers that I know of that ever graduated from college. And I've got 5 children. The oldest is Julianne Flowers Daniels. She's got 3 kids. This girl is the flower age children, and she did not want a college education. In fact, she dropped out of high school and went to work and then finally got a GED. She had 3 children, William Matthew, Travis Austin, and Lawrence Daniels. I have a middle daughter, Pamela Lee Buckley, who's married to Lawrence Campbell Buckley, Jr., and they have 4 boys, aged 10 to probably about 5 now. And I have a baby daughter, Elizabeth Allen Flowers Grindy, who has 4 children. She's first granddaughter out of 13 grandchildren, and 3 boys. They live in Tarpon Springs. And my son, Ben Jr., lives here in town. He has a wife, and they have 2 small boys. Then I have a younger son who's in Tallahassee, and he has a wife, and he hadn't started a family, so one of these days I'll have more than 13, I'm sure, which is a bunch of grandkids. But when I graduated from Stetson, C.H. Smith, who had been an undertaker in Ohio and a real estate agent in Florida, was a real good friend of the family. And he wanted me, when I graduated, to apply for a job at what was then DeLand Federal Savings and Loan. And I did. And C.B. Stout was the manager then, and he made me an offer. College education, starting out. Of course, I knew the savings institution and banks, whatever then, never paid much money. But he made me an offer of 90 cents an hour, starting pay, $36 a week. This was 1953. And I went to Mr. C.H. and I said, Mr. Smith, I can't work for that. I says, I make that much on a weekend guiding. He says, son, stick with it. It'll be good to you. So I did. And went to work for them. I hadn't worked very long, and they made me assistant secretary for the association, and I was secretary to the board of directors. In 1954, when I got married, our president of the association was George Marks. And I told him before time, I says, you know, my wife's going to graduate with a teaching degree in math here when we get married this August, and so she needs a job. And so she was hired at DeLand Junior High as a math teacher, and she worked there for 3 years, and then then she went into preschool work and worked for First Presbyterian Church of DeLand for 20-some years teaching preschool. She left there and went down to First Presbyterian Church in DeBary and started a preschool for them there, and ran it as head teacher and director for 7 years before she retired. But I worked for the Savings and Loan in DeLand for about 10 years, and I left DeLand and I went to First Federal in New Smyrna as assistant to the president. And I worked there for about 4 years, and then I left there out of a bad situation and went into the personal insurance business. And in 1968, my mother and dad died, and mother died first in January, and my dad deeded me the riverfront property out there after mother died, and kept a life estate in it, and he died in June 7th, right after mother died. So my wife and I and 5 children moved out to the river, and we've been out there since June of '68, and I guided probably from '68 on. I've probably guided as many days as I sold insurance. And as of this date, about 10 years ago, I decided that I didn't need the aggravation of driving to Orlando once a week or Tampa once a month on the insurance business, and I took a broker's license, and then I really started guiding. And the last few years, I'll be 70 come August. The last few years, I've cut way down on my guiding. I don't guide that much anymore. I do a lot of fishing myself. I take a lot of my good friends fishing, and especially my wife. She loves to fish. And you're going to try to enjoy what few years I've got left. I spend a lot of time talking to people about the river, what needs to be done, and some of the things that are out there that shouldn't be out there. And
what are some of those things?
Well, the river speed limits are not scientific that the DEP has put out there. They looked at a map and they just said, in Tallahassee, not knowing the river, and said, this is it. When the speed limits first came in, they had places with slow speed that it was impossible to get to from the river to the area by boat. You could drag one through the swamp or through the marsh and get to it, but that's the only way. But one of the people involved in this was just like the big long 12 months out of the year slow zone around Blue Springs. It was just to get the Orlando boats off of the river. But not only it does that, but it also keeps the local people from using it, or if they use it in a reasonable amount of way, they get a ticket. And it's been so unfair. In the refuge area itself, since they've been keeping records, there has never been a recorded manatee fatality in the refuge area. And I will say it's all slow speed. And they developed their own slow speed definition. Most of this water is Coast Guard water. Coast Guard rules say slow speed is 5 to 7, period. But they added to their definition, if your bow is raised, you're in violation. If white water's coming off the back of your boat, you're in violation. So they come up with their own definition, which right now is superseding the Coast Guard rule. It's so unfair. When Mr. Conklin and Mr. Rose came down to the Highland Park Fish Camp several years ago, there was 3 television stations there. There were several newspaper people there. They would not talk to anybody. I made them talk to me.
Now, who are they?
They were Conklin. Mr. Conklin was the head of the endangered species part there, I think, and Pat Rose was the one that was the program manager. And they got in the boat with a deputy sheriff who did not know the river, and he went out through the Norstead River, across Lake Woodruff, and then into Tick Island Run. And when you're going out from Tick Island Run into Lake Dexter, there's an island that's there. The right-hand side is real shallow. And the left-hand side, of course, is the old ship channel that came in from the days of steamboats, went all the way up to DeLand Springs. And they came back, and that was a corridor for the Highland Park Fish Camp and Tedder's Fish Camp in there, and the people coming from Astor to come into thing. And I get out my coastal geodetic survey map, and I show him. I said, you know, Pat Rose, you made another mistake. Look here, you got a foot of water over here in low water. Everybody's going to burn their engine up. And I said, here's the channel right here, over here. And he looked at my map and he said, where'd you get a map like this? Didn't even know there was one, you know. But Pat Rose and Clay Henderson got together, and I guess in Tallahassee or some dark room somewhere, and looked at a map and said, this is going to be it. And that's it. And it's all uncalled for. We have not hurt the manatee population, boats have not, and the St. Johns River. It's wide enough and it's deep enough that they can get away from it. Yes, there's one occasionally killed, but it needs to be fine-tuned from what it is. Where it'll ever get done or not, I don't know. I hope before I die.
I want to go back and ask you about growing up and when you were younger. What kind of medical care was available? Was it home remedy kinds of things?
Well, I can only remember going to a medical doctor one time. And that's when I was on that little scooter I was telling you about, and a thing turned over and a piece of tin which was around, they used to put around the old wash pots outside when they boiling that and when using sticks and all. And of course there wasn't a fire going there, but there was a piece of tin there that shielded the wind that you could move around. And I fell and the tin went right under my chin here, and that's the only time I can ever remember going to a doctor when I was a kid. There was an old Indian medicine man lived out on the road between Cassadaga and Orange City. His name was Dr. Spanto, and any kind of rash or cold, just about anything, I guess, except broken arm. If you had a broken arm, I'll knock on wood, I've never had a broken bone yet. But never remember going to doctor. Always went to Dr. Spanto for colds, rashes, ringworms, anything. Go over there, and that old Indian, he would get some stuff and mix it all up and make a salve or a potion and give it to you. Remember taking a lot of kerosene and turpentine on sugar back when I was a kid. If you stepped on a nail, you didn't go get a tetanus shot. You washed it off good, and everybody had a kerosene stove. Everybody. And you always had a 5-gallon can of kerosene around. You stepped on a rusty nail, you just soaked your foot in that kerosene, and you never got lockjaw or anything else. You didn't go get a tetanus shot. I think I went to the, well, no, I didn't, because I remember one time when I was a kid, just flashed back through this feeble mind of mine, that Mother was downstairs. We lived in Lake Helen, and she was helping Dad get the shiners out of the pool down there for him to go fishing, and she had a big mess of fish frying on the kerosene stove, and the grease caught on fire, and I went in there and grabbed it to pull it off, and the grease sloshed over and went down this arm and down this leg. And that was the day that they were going to take the school children to the Volusia County Fairgrounds out here by the railroad station. And Mama says, "You can't go to that." And I says, "Well, you get me some help here." And she took me to school, and I think there was a school nurse there that day. She bandaged my arm and my leg up, and we got on the school bus and went to see the county fair out at the old fairgrounds. Speaking of the county fairgrounds, you know, during World War II, they built a fellow named Babcock built a lot of gliders out at the fairground for the Army, which they used them in the invasion of France when they liberated Europe. There and out here on Spring Garden Avenue where the railroad track crosses there was a building there, and they built. My dad worked there when after he quit in Maryland and came down. He worked in there in the glider factory for a while doing carpentry because they were made out of wood framing. And our old house when I was a kid, it's still standing in the lake. I'm one of the fellows that works for the county appraiser's office lives in it. My next door neighbor was Nathan and Dorothy Roberts. They're old time people there. Nathan ran the power plant and the ice plant. And as a kid, one of the big joys, because very few people had a refrigerator. Most everybody had an ice box. So there was no such thing as bringing ice cream home. It had to be eaten wherever you bought it, just about. But we would go down to, Nathan would let us kids go down to the ice house, and we'd scrape the snow off of the pipes. And we were 150 yards from the place, and we'd run home, and Mother had put milk and sugar or strawberry flavoring or something like that. And we had snow cones there. But also, too, there was nothing for a kid in Lake Helen to do to earn money. In the wintertime, yes, there was a few Yankees that would let you run their real push mower and mow their yard, or you can use their lively lead and whack it off. But the rest of the year there wasn't much to do. But the old mill in Lake Helen had burned down, and we would go over and we'd dig up iron and brass and whatever we could find over there. And my dad had a pickup truck, and he would bring it to the land and sell it for us. But Nathan would have the guys that changed the light bulbs around through Lake Helen bring all the light bulbs back. They had to, for every one they installed, they had to bring back the burned out one. And he would give the bulbs to his children and me and my brother, and we'd go over there at the dump, and we'd break the bulb and beat all the stuff out of it, and we'd save the brass bottom of the thing, and that went along with the iron and stuff when we did. It was a good day, you know. Mm-hmm. We didn't have television, of course. You know, most houses had one radio, and we didn't have the wants that people have today. All the kids got to have their own radio, own TV in their room.